Hello and welcome to the International Schools Podcast. I'm your host, Dan Taylor, and on the podcast we discuss all aspects of technology and life in international schools, with new episodes live every 2 weeks. We focus on people who are currently working in schools, and we talk about life in their current country and dive into some specific topics. The podcast is brought to you by Acer for Education. People always ask what Chromebooks we recommend and what Windows laptops we recommend, and after trying literally all of them, we always recommend Acer. If you'd like to get more info and try out some devices, please just go to gg.gg/Acer Education. That's gg.gg/Acer Education, and we'll get right back to you. Also, the podcast is brought to you by Apps Events. We're a Google partner. We work all around the world. We've just got one piece of new information right now. This is in January 2021. We're a G Suite Enterprise for Education partner. That's Giuseppe. This is a bunch of premium tools available to people using Google at their schools. We can help you get set up with a free 1-month trial. So please check out the link in the show notes and we'll do that right away. And now, on to the interview. Hello and welcome to the International Schools Podcast. Today I'm here with my host, John Mixon. How are you doing, John?
Great. I'm really excited because I'm a third culture kid and my kids are third culture kids, but I have read very little. So I am going to learn so much about maybe why I am who I am and what my kids are. So very excited, Dan, to be here today.
Definitely. Well, yeah, John's stolen my thunder, but we're talking with Ruth Van Reken, who is one of the co-authors of Third Culture Kids. John and me have both got third culture kids. My kids are just starting school. John's kids are just finished school. So we've got different perspectives here. I live in Prague, but we're going to be living in Middle East and Asia for a while in the future. So, and I'm English, obviously. So for me, it's interesting personally. But obviously your book is something of a sort of seminal book in international school circles. So it'd be great to learn more about you and your research in your life. So Ruth, thanks very much for joining.
Thank you for having me. This is always a topic I care a lot about because it's personal. I was born and raised in Nigeria as an American child. I raised my children in Liberia. My first granddaughter was born in Ghana. So on a personal level, it's of course important to me, but then I've had about 35 years of working with it professionally. And it has just been a fabulously interesting topic. And I think it's one that's incredibly timely for the world and all that we're seeing going on around us. And so thanks for having me, and I look forward to our discussion.
Great. Ruth, I mean, before we get into the book, I'm keen of what's your work background? What did you do? How did you end up traveling? And how did you end up getting in? What sort of brought you up to? I want to talk a bit later about how the book came about. But first of all, what was your kind of work experience? What did you do? Where did you live?
You won't probably believe this, but I am a registered nurse by trade.
I would believe it because it's on your LinkedIn profile.
Well, okay, believe it. No, I grew up in Nigeria. I always was going to go there and be a nurse and do something. I always had that feeling of doing something cross-cultural. And my parents were with a mission organization, and so they were teachers. And so that was just sort of my assumption. And I met someone who was also interested in doing medical work in Nigeria, which was the country of my birth. Unfortunately, or fortunately, when he was a medical student, we had a scholarship. And at that time, they wouldn't to do a series overseas, during one of his electives. And Nigeria would not give us a visa. And that was one of my first stunning moments of realizing that the country that I called home didn't see me in the same way. They'd been having the Biafran War, and right then they were just not granting Americans visas necessarily. So that's how we wound up in Liberia. And then when we went there later, they actually had Liberianized the nursing, and so they didn't really want me taking over a job from somebody else that was local. So that was another kind of stunning moment, like, wait, what am I supposed to do then? And so I wound up doing some things with international people, which I didn't even know was really a topic. But at the end of that time, of course, Liberia went through its civil war and the coup and things. So even though I thought we would stay there all our lives, we didn't. But as we were going to repatriate, our daughter came home 9 months ahead of us. Her grandma said, well, why don't you come home and you can stay with us and then you don't have to change schools next year. And that was all fine. But it created this great crisis in me that I finally thought, all my life I've had this place that I feel a sort of a depression or a sadness that I have no reason to feel externally. And so I wanted to explore that finally. And I started to do some journaling, which has turned in ultimately to my first book, Letters Never Sent. But at the time, I wasn't writing a book. I was just trying to understand my story. And I started with my first night in boarding school, which was when I was 6. And I started to write to my parents as if I was that child. And suddenly I was that child. I could feel her and all the things that all my life I had tried not to feel because I understood, I loved my life and all that. It seemed like it would be disloyal to say there were some hard places. So in that process, I began to realize the extent of loss in my life. And again, I say that loss is proportionate to how much you love. If I hadn't loved Nigeria, I wouldn't have missed it. But when I got to writing about the time of leaving, I suddenly realized that that was the day my world died, when I took that airplane ride. And so that was, a really big revelation to me. And to do my grief work 30 years later was kind of, shocking. But anyway, after that, I heard about this term TCK and that there was going to be a conference in the Philippines. And I met Dave Pollock through that. And it's a long story, but that was how it moved from being my personal story into working with it as a topic and realizing as people, when my first book came out, I heard from people all over the world saying I thought I was the only one. And that's when I thought, okay, this is more than my story. That's how it started.
Fantastic. And sorry, John.
So this is the 3rd edition of your book. So I assume when you first wrote it, as you said, people were suddenly like, oh my goodness me, that's me. So it really was quite seminal in the sense that you were really addressing this topic that maybe was floating around, but you put a name to it and then really identified some of the dispositions and kind of attitudes and values associated with that. So really, in some ways, you trailblazed this idea.
Well, I have to give credit to those whose shoulders I was standing on. Ruth Hussein was the first sociologist to put this name on it. That was in the 50s. She went with her husband to India and she wanted to study with him how people from different cultures did business together. But she became much more interested in the children of the expats. And she thought there's something different about them than the kids I'm teaching back at Michigan State. But actually, this whole topic in a way began in international school. It began in the 30s. Alan Parker did his master's. He was the principal of Woodstock School in India. And he was already noticing something about these kids. So anyway, Dr. Hussein named us in, 1960 was the first article that really came out. Dave Pollock went to Kenya in the 70s and he worked at an international school. And he had that same experience of realizing that these kids were different than the youth he had worked with back in the States. And Norma McKay had been a TCK and she called it global nomads. So there was this group of people who were feeling something was going on and they were starting to name what they were seeing. And so Dave Pollock had developed this profile, but he went around the world, school by school, trying to explain it. Ruth Hussein had told me, she said, well, it's not my job to, explain it. My job is to study it. But Dave was the one who took it to the masses in a sense and kept having this experience, the aha moment. All these people would hear it and think, oh my goodness, you've just told my life story. But then one day, it's a long story, we'd have many conversations and this developed out of conversations with people who lived it, people who were thinking about it. And we had great fun just trying to think about it. And I said to him one day, Dave, you need to write this because people are starting to write about this. I saw something in Wall Street Journal, something someplace else. I said, they're quoting you, but it's really the work you're doing. But he was having a hard time getting people to understand it. Even back at Michigan State, when Ruth Hussein went back, people didn't really believe in it as a topic. Anyway, Dave was, believing in it. he was doing it. And I said, you need to write. And he said, well, I don't have time. And so I said, well, I could help you because, how hard could that be? He's got it all developed. And then when we sent it to the publisher, the only people who would take it was Intercultural Press because nobody else believed it was still a topic. This was in the mid 90s. So when we sent it to them, they said, well, we're an academic publisher. You can't just describe it. You have to explain it. Why? I thought, I have no idea why. It just happens. So that became for me, and I have a mind that always asks the why question. So that became kind of fun to really listen and try to figure out, why does this happen? Why is it we had, one of the first things was delayed adolescence. But if you think about the developmental process where kids in a traditional way would be in one place and everybody has the same culture and everybody kind of reinforces it, a child has a strong sense as they develop of who they are, where they're going, how life is. But if you keep switching and you keep moving, you have to keep starting over in that process. You have to keep relearning what are the rules here. And so it's not that we can't learn in the end or something's deficient. It's just a different process. And that was the thing that, what are the losses? Because it's a series of losses. Every time you move, you're losing. But then the losses are hidden. They're not obvious losses. And so many people went to therapists, and the therapists, couldn't figure it out because they didn't see this world that was invisible. So that was the fun part. It was a lot of work, but it was wonderful work because every time it was explaining to me my own story too.
Fascinating. Absolutely fascinating.
Yeah, what could you, so I mean, obviously a lot of people listen to this have not read the book, but they have heard the term. It's kind of widely known term. Could you give us like I mean, I don't know how easy it is to distill it, but like a synopsis of the book? Like, how would you describe the broad theme of the book and what actually happens with third culture kids?
Well, first, in case somebody doesn't even know what a third culture kid is, I
Yeah.
would call at this point a traditional third culture kid, because we're starting to refine our language a little bit. Are those that Ruth Hussein first studied, somebody who accompanies their parents into another culture because of a parent's work. Now, there's lots of ways that kids, go that way now, but that would be the traditional third culture kid, that they spend a significant part of their early developmental years outside of their parents' passport culture. The reason that's important is because of the period of development. That's when you learn language, you learn culture, you learn identity, you learn belonging. And a lot of parents think that, oh, well, I've done the same thing, that my kids have done, like you, Dan. Maybe I grew up one place, but now I'm raising kids and I'm experiencing life with them, which you are. But my mother never doubted that she was from Chicago or that she was an American or anything like that, because she'd grown up in one place, in one neighborhood, and so forth. So no matter that she was 34 years in Nigeria, that was never a question. For me, she said once, well, until you did this crazy work, I thought you were from Chicago too. I said, Mom, think about it. I'm born in Africa. My whole life I'm raised there. I'm not identifying, with this thing. So parents, my developmental process in terms of identity was different than my mother's, even though she lived in Africa with me. So parents need to understand that this is part of the reason that it's important is that it's happening when a child is developing their sense of identity, their sense of self, and all these things. So that's who a TCK is. In the book, we start out with a story of Erica, who grew up as a business kid in Singapore, and it's a real story. It's a different name, but we asked her if we could tell her story, and she felt Singapore was home. And of course, then she goes back to the States. And for most people, the time of reentry is difficult because you're supposed to be. I was supposed to be American at 13 when I came back to the States, but I didn't know who Elvis was. I didn't know how the clothes were. I didn't know how sports were. I didn't know any of the cultural things I was supposed to know. So then people think, what's the matter? So it's her story of the typical TCK who tries to fit back in. And then she went back to Singapore thinking, well, I'm from Singapore, really, so I'll be okay. But going back as an adult was not the same thing. And so she was caught between the two worlds, which is the story for so many of us. So that's the beginning. And then we try and go through not only who are third culture kids, but the last few years, as we talked about this, so many people said to me, I didn't do it your way, but I relate to everything you're saying and why. And so I put another term for that, cross-cultural kids, people who've been raised among many cultural worlds for any reason, and that would include TCKs. And so that's kind of an evolving thing right now. How do we look at the big picture? But I want to say for international school people, you have a lot of local kids coming to your school now, and they're also cross-cultural kids. They're what I would call educational CCKs or TCKs, because when they come to a school like that and they go back to their environment in in a neighborhood, they have had a totally different experience culturally than the kids who are going to the local schools. And so that's another thing of great interest to me. How do we put that together? So then we have that sort of introductory phase, why cross-cultural childhood matters and why high mobility, because those are the two hallmarks that we have. Mobility is high mobility. If I'm not going, my best friend is going. So my life is always in a flux in a certain sense. Most TCKs are. And so it's that first section is the introduction of setting the scene. The next section is about the third culture kid profile. This is the work that Dave did, particularly in identifying the common characteristics. That you can have a large worldview and you don't know your own culture. That you can have lots of relationships and yet they keep, they're in flux all the time. There's a lot of rootlessness and restlessness among us because kids are so used to moving that it's almost like I have to move to stay somebody. And so that's another issue, and that can also be very detrimental to a person's career, or it can be helpful that you're willing to move. But kids sometimes, move when they don't have to, or they have a hard time even finishing university at one point. And also, what it's like to um, come back and the reentry and all these things that are very common in our story. Then we talk about um, grief and loss and identity. That's some of the beginning, but we go through then some of the issues of how does the how does the internet work? How do all those things? What are some of the impacts of the change? That certainly has come more in our later editions. And then in this last edition, Michael Pollock, who was Dave Pollock's son, Dave died in 2004. And so Michael has been an educator overseas, and of course he grew up with this topic. So he added some wonderful pieces about what schools can do, what organizations can do, what parents can do, some how-to chapters for the people that work with TCKs. So that's the essence. And then the last chapter we threw in this time is the vision we see for the future, how far we still have to go.
Wow.
A big topic.
Yeah, it's interesting. John, I'm sure I'm just going to jump into one topic, but John, you jump in other ones. I mean, what's interesting for me, John and me are both tech guys, and online communities and the internet, how much is that changing me? I'll just tell you from sort of my perspective is like, I'm involved in a lot of online communities, different things, with a lot of international school educators, with entrepreneurs. I'm an entrepreneur in sort of I guess ed tech sort of space. And I've got one group I'm a member of, and we meet up in different countries. I'm actually a meet up in Mexico in October. We normally meet in Bangkok. And so we've actually got this cross-cultural group of similar-minded people, and we're in touch daily, but we're all from different countries and a lot of different ethnic backgrounds and countries. And that's, I wonder if that online way is leading to a different sense of you've got your physical place where you live, but then you've got much more of an online place where you live as well.
Well, I think certainly the last 2 years has made a huge reality, because suddenly I went from traveling and going to individual schools and individual people, and I had 5 trips canceled when COVID hit, and I thought, oh my goodness, my life is over. But as it's turned into podcasts and broadcasts and things, you do reach a different group of people. But one really interesting thing, we started a group called Families in Global Transition in 1999, I guess, in Indianapolis here, because we felt like the world was coming here and people here didn't see it. Well, it's a long story how that has evolved, and people far more gifted than I am have taken it over. But this past year, of course, it was all online, as all the conferences were. And I thought, how is this ever going to work? Because part of our intensity is being together and so forth. But they did a wonderful job of having group chats all through the weekend. And we all lived in our computers. And it was incredibly enriching because we had more people could come. People didn't have to spend their money. And I thought, wow, we miss the coffee hours, but they really made up for it in a wonderful way. And I met new people and I thought, wow, this is a different way. And it's efficient. We're not sitting in airports all the time. So certainly this is changing. But the other thing that even changed a little bit, I should say, is Dave went everywhere trying to, get the topic going. But it was when somebody made the first tckid.com way back group. And all of a sudden, I think they had like 20,000 people. Suddenly, it became an available topic if you weren't at the schools David went to. So I credit the internet. And of course, now there's 100 million, different podcasts and things out there. If you just do TC Kid or TCK, you'll find all these groups. And certainly that has increased incredibly much, the awareness and the place where people find out they're not alone and they have their aha moments, and you see the same things. And then it's also going to the next level with TCKs of Asia have their podcast now, and talking about things that I never knew about, how it is to do language. I mean, you're right. Technology is transforming this topic.
Definitely, but I guess not just a topic, but third culture online. You can have a different culture online to that, which I think is fascinating. But that's really interesting.
Yeah.
John, so.
No, Ruth, it's so interesting listening to you because my father's American, my mom's Swiss, and I lived in 3 different countries in Europe. I've lived in 9 countries to this date. And I went to the Swiss schools, and even though I spoke fluent French and had a Swiss passport, I never really fit in because I had this American father. And this was in the 70s, so it was a different dynamic then. And then at 18, I went to Cleveland, Ohio, to university at Kent. And I landed there and I sounded like an American, but as you said, I knew nothing about the TV stations, the culture, the food. And it's just so interesting to hear you identify that, because when I experienced it, I just thought, don't really know what's going on. And I think that process, and your book especially, I'm thinking my own 2 children, I think that's a really important point of reference for kids to develop some clarity on maybe what they're feeling and what they're going through. Because I think my generation that were third culture kids, that was nothing. And it wasn't even a topic. I don't even remember people, even though we spoke French, German, and English in the home and lived in England, Germany, Switzerland. So I just think a book like this and this work actually has a very positive impact on, I'm just thinking my son and daughter that have lived in 6 different countries and never really lived in their passport country. They have a Swiss and American passport. So I just really find that personally very interesting. And I can see how those groups that you're talking about, the online groups, really become a powerful venue for people to kind of synthesize what they're feeling and create some identity, not cultural identity, but just identity with what's going on. And I think I really applaud all that work that's going on, because I think that's the challenge for my 2 children, is they're really not sure where home is. Mm-hmm. And even though we have a place in Switzerland, they go back to California to see their maternal relatives. It just doesn't, it's not home, and it's never home. And so home becomes where the family unit is, where mom and dad are together. It could be anywhere. It could be at a Sheraton, at a hotel, it could be in a campsite. So I think I hear more and more of that. And I'm just wondering if you think in this process, home has changed, and that people then gravitate to their families or their connections to make that strength more than the physical location.
Well, John, I think you could write the book now. So
I'm not writing a book. Dan, we're writing a book.
Yeah.
No, but
we'll do an audiobook.
Yeah, this is what the story is that you were saying, Dan, it was interesting. You said there's a third culture online. I thought this third culture really is the shared experience. It's not just amalgamating, that I have Africa and America. It's this experience I share. Culture has to be shared. And this experience of living in between. is what we share with each other. So it's interesting you were saying that, we have an online third culture. I'll have to think about that. That's another piece for my brain today. But
Yeah.
what you're talking about, John, there's two things. First, your story is part of the development of the increased cultural complexity that is going on today. When I grew up, most of the kids had parents from the same country. Now, my father happened to be a TCK who grew up in Iran. So he was American, but usually most TCKs had parents from the same country and so forth. In today's world, that's not so. So you're already an example of in the very home, you have multiple cultures in your home. And when you go visit your grandparents, you probably use different languages. So the world is really enlarging in that way. It's becoming more complex. But my goal and my desire, my passion in life is to normalize what we feel. Because the biggest thing for so many of us is that we thought, what's wrong with me? I'm 13. I don't know what's happening. Okay, what's wrong with me? And that was my feeling, like something's the matter with me. I can't figure this out. So when I went to high school, I didn't tell anybody that I'd ever been anywhere out of the country because I didn't want to be, weird. And when you came back and you thought, well, that's just the way it is, but it's still that feeling of what's the matter with me. When we can get language and understanding for this concept, and this is what it's all about, and that's why schools are doing transition programs. So, the whole issue of how do we do transition well? So you can say goodbye, so you can move on to the next place without all the losses just kind of, ruminating someplace. When we normalize it, then we can use it. The gifts are also many, but many people get caught in the challenges of what's the matter with me, then depression, and feeling like, I just can't figure life out. But once we understand, and that's why these groups are so important too, because they find out, oh, I'm not the only one. Other people felt that, like that. And you ask about where's home, that's the cardinal question. When I say to somebody, where are you from? And they can't answer, then I think, well, I know I've got one. I mean, my husband says, how do you find all these people? And I say, it depends how they answer my question. But also the issue of where is home is that's even more than where you're from, because home is an internal place of belonging, that sense that this is where I really belong. And for some, that really becomes a stress. And number one, I think you're right. Many find that place of belonging in relationships and with their parents. Home is wherever my parents are, is a common answer. But I've also found that I am at home in many places now. I feel at home when I get off the airplane in Africa and I smell home. And I feel at home here in Indianapolis now that I've lived here for a long time, because this is where my kids relate. And I feel at home in Chicago. So, but I feel particularly at home in the international community. When I travel and I get there, I don't even know the people, but I feel at home because it's a way of life that I know. And I realize this is a place I belong. Other people belong to their communities. But once I really understood that I have a place that is my community, even though it's very disparate and it's very global and I don't see everybody, it gave me space to realize that back here in Indianapolis, I don't know all about my neighbors' communities, and things like that, but we can be neighbors. But I don't have to insist that people see this life that I have that, I can't explain if they don't
It's
live it.
interesting, like this sense of belonging, because to take me as an example, it's interesting. I'm very, very different background to John. I grew up in rural Yorkshire in Northern England. And I mean, don't get me wrong, I had a great childhood. My parents are great. We did a lot of cool stuff, but we didn't really travel. And I never felt at home there. I never felt I really belonged to that community. And again, nothing bad about it. I just didn't feel I ever fitted in there. And then as soon as I got to 18, went to university, I've been a third culture adult. I don't know if that's a thing,
Yeah,
but
it is
ever since I've just traveled. Oh, and I don't think that'll ever stop. Like I haven't even told John, but we're going to be moving for a bit in November. I've always lived abroad, and I can honestly never see myself going back to Yorkshire apart from to see my family. And my experience is like John. I mean, John's children's experience, I think, is my home is where my wife and my kids are. My kids are young, but that's my family. I've got friends here in Czech Republic. I've got friends in America, in Asia, in England, and like you said, I've got a few kind of bases, but I feel it's a cheesy phrase, but I do feel like a global citizen. Like I'm not like a globalist or anything, but I feel like a home. I feel more at home visiting a new country than I do in the place I come from, you know?
No, I really appreciate that, Dan, because I guess the thing I forgot to say was nobody's experience is universal. My sister bought a home when she came back to the States. When she got married, she's been in the same one 55 years. And, so we all have our different responses. And I think there's also something, of course, the individual, people like you, for whatever reason, there are people who, even as children, always wanted to travel or they wanted to be out. So we need to acknowledge that. And another study that hasn't been done enough yet, but is on the books, is third culture adults, what you're saying, people who make that first trip later. How does that relate to the third culture experience, the third culture kid experience? And so those are all things. This topic is like limitless right now, as far as the research and what needs to be understood. But I feel like the TCK topic was sort of like a petri dish where maybe for the first time a topic was studied that was transnational, that it was trans ethnicity, transracial, in the sense that people who've done it were from all these different backgrounds, but they shared something. And that was the first knock on it. Like, well, how can you say that people from all these places share something when, that's not. In fact, I had one sociologist said, if you can prove that, you'll change the face of sociology, because it's not supposed to be that way. But on the emotional spaces of life, if we think about who people are, people need to be relational, people are emotional, people are creative. What is the essence of being human? When we move, we lose relationships, and everybody will feel it, even if they gain on the other side. So there's this emotional space that we share. And the biggest issues that have to be figured out for most TCKs, and maybe for you too, Dan, if you didn't fit where you were, is who am I? What's my identity? And I think we start to find that when we have something in our latest book about anchors and mirrors, that we learn that in relationship to those who are around us. And, if it keeps switching, that's one of the reasons it's complicated.
Yep.
But we have the identity question, and then we have the loss question. And so the attachment, all these things are part of it. But the effects of cross-culturalness and the effects of mobility, usually people wind up coming to some sort of terms with who am I, like, okay, well, it's okay that I don't fit in a place because I have this other world I fit in. The place where I see people really caught up the most is when they don't know how to do the grief. They didn't know how to do, that was my story, but I see people still depressed, or they can be very angry. Anger is part of grief, when they're in their 50s and 60s, and they're still kind of pushing out relationships. Because one of the things that happens when you keep losing relationships is you decide not to engage. And people can engage to a certain level, but this really can impact those close relationships we all want to have. And so it's part of the work is helping people understand why they may push people away when they don't want to. And how can we work with that so we can invite people in and be fully who we are, and that we can engage in this incredible, we have incredible gifts as well. I love traveling, I love the world, I love all kinds of things that are interesting to me. But if I'm living in internal depression, I'm never going to be able to engage, both to live for myself, but to use who I am. And so that's why I feel so strongly. I just believe there are so many gifts, but I've seen people be very caught in the questions of where do I belong, where's identity, and every human has a need to belong. So if we can help each other that way, we have a lot of fun.
Great.
It's interesting that you talk about this gift and the grief and relationships, because being an international school educator, I've noticed we do a lot of celebrations and acknowledgement of kids leaving, but there are a lot of kids that are there constantly, and all they see is a turnstile of kids leaving, and there's not often a reflection about, well, what about this kid that now has had his fifth best friend leave in his time? And I think that's really quite a challenge. The other thing that I would be curious to hear your opinion on is international schools love doing what they call UN Day. UN Day is where the kids march around and they have to pick a flag and a costume and then they walk around. And it's a costume and flag that represents their country. And I know that my two own children found that very challenging because, yeah, they could yodel maybe and they could wear a cowboy hat. But it's that where sometimes international schools, I think, that's the challenge that we face is how do we accommodate, say, for example, Dan's kids. Dan is not a third culture kid, but he's a third culture adult, and now his kids go into school. How do you navigate that to support parents and students with this identity that's so fluid? And I find that quite a challenge. I'm just curious, what do you think schools can do to support that?
Well, you bring up two huge issues. So let me take first the stayers. That's what we call them, those who stay. I don't know if you've heard yet about Safe Passage Across Network. Doug Ota, sorry, I'm looking at your name, Dan. Doug Ota was a counselor at the American School of The Hague, and through a Shell Oil grant and other things, they developed a very strong transition program for the school. He has written a book called Safe Passage, which is how schools can set up strong transition programs. He has also developed an organization now, which is just taking off, of training people, training schools, because his view is if you have a really good program in your school for how do you do transition well, not just for the kids that are leaving, but for those who are staying. You're absolutely right. Some of the most damage is the kids who never got to go and only see the loss. Like one said to me, she said, especially the kids of the educators often are them, that I never had the fun of going. All I had was the pain of losing. Yep. And so part of the story is exactly what you've identified. So Doug's vision would be that one day schools could be certified as transition-friendly schools, that they would take this program, and they're just getting it off the ground now. Disclosure, I guess I'm on the board, so I'm supposed to say something, but I really, really, really believe in this. And Doug is doing his PhD this year on attachment in international schools and studying the kids, what really happens in the attachment theories and where our attachment places are when there's always this coming and going. So he's going to have some great data for us shortly. But if you don't know that, if anybody who's listening doesn't know about Safe Passage as a book, and also it's spanschools.org on the internet. And they are going to be developing training programs. So people from schools can send, their people there to be trained in how do you do an effective transition program. Because as Dave always quotes Doug always quotes Dave Pollock, that if you don't leave right, you can't enter right. So a good goodbye means a good hello. And so his thing is if you could get a lot of schools doing the same basic program, like an IB program would be academically, then when kids leave one place and go to the next place, they're received into that fold of good transition. So that's something that's on the horizon. If people aren't aware of it yet, they need to be. So that was your
first. Put that in the show notes, Ruth. Thank you for that lead. We'll definitely put that on the show notes for our audience, the Safe Passage in Doug Otta's work. Thank you.
So that was your first question. Now, your second question was about not stayers. What was your second question?
It's about the UN Day.
Thank you. Thank you. I'm 76. I'm having a little trouble. Memory. So on the UN Day, I mean, I hear the stories all the time. Which do I pick? Or somebody's parents get mad because the kid doesn't pick their passport culture. And so if you're a parent listening, don't be mad because the kid may feel more affinity for something else. So for some of the kids, it's hard. And in the TCKs of Asia podcast, which I sent you the link for also, they have mixed loyalties is one of their discussions. How do I even know where I fit? But far more than that, what bothers me in the diversity programs and all this, Litt.D, is they only go to the visible. They only look at the food. They only look at the flags. They only look at the costumes, who's looking at the deeper parts of culture? And who's understanding that what Danao Tanu taught me, who has been part of the TCKs of Asia, but she did her PhD work in the Asian TCKs. And her book is called Growing Up in Transit. And every international school should read that book as well. Danao came to me about 10 years ago and she said, you guys say that you're so global and you're so aware, and you have a large worldview. She said, that's really not true. I said, why? She said, I'm Asian. Her mom is from Japan. Her dad is Indonesian. She went to an international school. She said, I had to be Western by day to fit in because the school was Western. And she said, nobody at school knew who I was when I went home.
Interesting.
My parents did not want me to ask questions. You're in this IB, it's all question and you go home and you ask questions like that, you're in trouble. She said, nobody knew who I was when I went home. So I've started asking when I done international schools in pre-COVID days or pre-life days, I found out kids don't ever want to be told who they are. Okay, so I always ask for a panel representing the different kids in the school, culturally, background-wise, whatever, like a local kid, somebody from whatever their dominant groups are. I ask them simple questions. Tell me your passport. It's always interesting how many they have, how many languages. Then I say, so what do you like best about this? They give me the profile. What's the hardest? They can tell you, you just can't tell them. That's fine. So I've learned to say, what is different for you when you're at school and when you go home? It is unbelievable, what the kids say. And I thought it's really true. We don't understand because they have to be Western. They learn to accommodate to our culture and we assume that's who they are. So for Danao, she said she started to develop a self-induced racism that if she had just been white, she would have been okay. And of course, that's a terrible thing. So this is in an international school where everybody thinks that they're very global and we're IB and we can all, and I'm sure she could put on her costume and she could wear it. But what does that do for her inside? You still don't see her. So one of the great challenges, I think, for international schools now is developing an awareness of the deeper places of where who we are. Yes, we're together as TCKs, but we still come from different, backgrounds. And one of the stories that's on the TCK as of Asia podcast is Isabel Min talking about all she wanted was a red lunchbox because she was a diplomat's kid from Korea. And all the American kids, all the Western kids had metal lunchboxes, and she had to bring hers in a bag. And the day that somehow she found, I think she still has her little red lunchbox. And the stories, because these podcasts have been just people sharing their stories, sort of investigating how this group feels, or people who are not Western and have different languages. And anyway, they all had a lunchbox story of what it was they wanted, so they could be normal in the school. It's very powerful. And then another girl, Aiko, who's getting her PhD, was talking about when she came to the States and went to a local school, but see, this could be an international school too. And her parents got called. She didn't speak English, of course. And her parents got called because she wasn't participating in gym. And they said, well, language is one thing, but gym is gym. So her mother came to school and anyway, they started gym class. And so her mother said, Aiko, why aren't you playing in gym? And Aiko had no idea this was gym because in Japan, they did exercises, they changed uniforms, they went to a special place for gym. And these kids didn't change, and they just pushed the tables back and they were running around in the cafeteria. And she kept trying to figure out why these kids are running around the cafeteria. Because her background had a different story about what gym was. And these are the kind of stories that the uniform doesn't tell. The food doesn't tell. And even more than that, if I may go another couple places, how we do schooling. Kids learn by rote in many countries. And so when they come to international schools, and this whole thing is about IB and all that, that's great, but it's a different style of learning. And it's a different way of learning, let alone, that kids I was in one school And there was a whole Korean contingent that had just come because of a plant that had just come to that country. So the kids were learning English and all these things. And so in that school, they were saying to the kids, you can't speak Korean to each other, which is another story. But there was a friction going on between the Korean parents and the American educators. And so when we were having a discussion about it, it turned out that the kids were going home and saying to the parents that the American teachers didn't know anything. And you know why? Every time they asked them a question, the American teacher said, what do you think? And if they had known, they would have told them. So the interpretation of how we educate can be profoundly different. And even one Canadian Japanese teacher in international school said she had trouble while she was in a Japanese school, having kids switch their papers to critique each other, when you have a writing assignment and you make comments, because culturally you don't criticize. So all of these things have to be taken into account in a way the international schools didn't have to do before. Because if you had an American school, you probably had mostly American kids. If you had a Japanese school, Japanese. But I think there's just this whole realm of cultural understanding that we need to do for each other that really would make us richer, all of us richer, but also would help the kids and so forth. So anyway, that's my soapbox for today.
Fascinating. Have you read a book by Pico Iyer called The Global Soul? I don't know if you've heard of this book.
Yes, and he came to one of our family global transition conferences, and I came to two of them actually. And I think what he was shocked was to find this whole group of people that understood him. When he told his story, usually it's this really radical story. And no, he's wonderful. And
John, if you haven't read any of his books, Video
I
Night in
have.
Kathmandu, Video Night in
Video
Kathmandu,
Nights in
30 years ago.
Kathmandu for me was my entry into Pico Air and a lot of those third culture writers.
Yeah, I actually read that book when I was traveling around after university. I was in Kathmandu, funnily enough. I've got the knockoff version they sell. But it was interesting because in The Global Soul, it's a long time since I've read it, probably 20 years. But he talks about, like, there's almost this. We're talking now about cultures, we've got a culture of America and a culture of whatever, but there's almost like a global kind of middle class culture. And this is specifically with international schools. The kids who go there grow up, they might live in Bangkok, they might live in Ghana, somewhere in Ghana, but they're not in the local culture. They're in a lot of kids of foreign business people, wealthy local people, people working for NGOs and governments abroad. So they're this kind of culture kind of almost becomes their host culture in a way. I don't know what you think about that.
Well, that's really the third culture. It's not what you were at home in your passport culture, and it's not.
That is a third culture, yeah.
It's that in-between space between the two, but it's the space that you share with other people who are living it like you. Yeah. That's really what the third culture is. So one of the problems or surprises for kids, they've gone to these different schools. In international schools, it's normal to have new kids coming and going. And this is our culture, the way we're doing our lives. And so when kids go back, they may think, I've been in all these countries, I know all these things. But then when they go back to a school, a local school, like in whatever country they're from, and most of the kids aren't used to that kind of travel, it's harder to find your way in. It's harder because those kids have their groups, where in our international schools, in a way, the groups are always forming. But another thing that you should know in the international school is that when a child enters this kind of a lifestyle in high school or junior high, it's the same kind of re-entry that we had going back to our passport culture, because they don't know this lifestyle.
Yeah.
Suddenly their parents take them, and then there's a terrific video. It's 20 minutes. It got the Oscar nomination. It's called The Road Home. It was one of the last 10 in the Oscar shorts in 2012. And, this kid has grown up in England. He's an Indian, and his parents sent him back to India to go to school so that he can be, Indian, but it's an international school. And he doesn't fit. I mean, he runs away, and it's a marvelous film just in terms of identity. But I showed that to a group of TCKs once. I said, okay, so who do you identify with? And they said, the bullies, the other kids at the school. I said, I was surprised it was disclosure. And I said, why? They said, well, we had a girl that came like that, and she refused to be part of us. She didn't like it. She was kept talking about being at home. So we finally decided, well, then fine. If we don't like us, we won't like you. And so, that we have to realize it is that much of a culture, and kids who know it know it. But when somebody comes for the first time, as a teenager, as a junior higher, it's a new world for them, and
Yeah.
so it's not so easy sometimes.
Ruth, when you have seen in your experiences and through the writing and research, have you noticed a pattern of third culture kids generally getting into relationships with other third culture kids, and then they tend to propagate that by being third culture with their own kids? Is there a pattern because there's that comfort zone? I'm more comfortable not being attached to somewhere. Have you been, is that something that is noticed, or is it really kind of not enough of a pattern to say that's a pattern?
Well, I think it certainly is talked about a lot, and I think many TCKs do marry somebody that's got some kind of a background. I mean, you should marry somebody that at least is willing to think about your story. Um, and so I think that there are some TCKs that said nobody can ever understand me if they're not a TCK. Well, I'm so different, nobody can understand me. That's not healthy, because we're still human beings, and our story came within the context. I tell people this is not your identity, it's your experience. And so if you think about your experience of cultural displacement, other people have that. You can identify if you think about loss. So there should be some place where on an emotional basis people can share. But a lot of TCKs do marry somebody of at least some kind of background, or they marry somebody who's not from their nationality. They marry a French person if they're from the States, or they marry somebody that's more international. On the other hand, there's people like my sister, and she married somebody who grew up monoculturally, and they've lived in this one house for 55 years, and yet they like to travel, and they took foster kids in. I mean, there were a lot of things they did that were whatever. And then their daughter her husband worked for the State Department, so her daughter's been the one who's done the third culture lifestyle. So it's kind of there. And my daughter married somebody who's more local, but when my granddaughter was 5, she said to me, Grandma, I'm going to travel with you one day. And she might have been like you, Dan. So she grew up in Indianapolis, and she chose to go to university in Spain, because she said, I got to see the world here. I got to get out of here. I got to go. So she's going to university in Spain. And I always thought people from there came here, but I thought, well, I guess you can go there too. She's had a fabulous time. So the TCK rootness or something seems to be generationally propagated. But
John, I've actually got a question for you. Interestingly, some advice for me, I guess, because obviously your kids are a bit further down the line. Your children are third culture kids, and a huge number of your friends. Nothing specific about your kids, but your friends generally have third culture kids. So, would you say, when you look at that huge sort of group of all your friends who've grown up with kids in a similar environment, would you say the children generally view it as positive, or would you say, because for me it's like a dream childhood, but would you say it's generally positive, generally negative, or is it kind of all over the place in terms of how children view it? I know it's a big question, but do you have any general thoughts on that?
I think I'm going to talk about myself, because I grew up in Nyon, which is a town outside of Geneva. My dad was a UN diplomat, and everybody I interacted with in my town, a big percentage were multicultural, Portuguese, Italian father, or whatever, because of the UN and the international organizations. But there was not that label, and it was kind of just, that's the way it is. And then when we went off to universities, and I went to a boarding school in England, there were many more kids like that. I think with my own 2 children, I think it's because, I don't know, I think it's harder. And why, I don't know. And I've talked to many students that have experienced what I have in international schools. And I think there's more of a creative tension. There's more introspection than maybe I had. And then I think of some of my contemporaries. because it wasn't labeled. It was just like, well, that's the way things are, and maybe we didn't reflect on it. While now, I don't know. That's such a tough question, and I hate to generalize.
No.
And but I know, for example, my children in their cohort of international school, third culture, there's much more creative tensions. There's more questioning, and there's more inner angst, if I can say that. And I don't want to overgeneralize, but it's just some little things I've noticed. And if I think of my brother and sister and myself and our contemporaries, I don't think we talk about it as much as maybe now international schools are with their kids. And Ruth, I don't know. I really, this is a personal, so to the audience, I'm not overgeneralizing. I'm just taking anecdotes
it was
from
a big question,
Yeah,
and that could probably be because I guess just that as generations go on, there is, I guess when we grew up, people did question things less, I guess. I mean, you might have done internally, but you didn't discuss things as openly as people do now, which is a huge benefit of times now. Yeah, Ruth, what do you think, Ruth?
Well, I think for a long time I said I really hadn't met one person who was sorry for it. I think there are some people now who are saying, that we went through our trials and tribulations, but in terms of the ultimate gift of this experience and what it gave us and how it shaped our lives would be positive. In an ultimate sense. But I think that, like for me, I didn't even understand my story until later. And it doesn't mean I was sorry for it. It just means that I had to process it. But I think one thing that's happening is there's way more mobility now. I don't know, like you said, we were in groups. Like I was always either in the States or in Nigeria. Kids now are 10, 11, 12 schools sometimes, depending on where they've been. And the world has got more angst because there's a lot more, I don't know, just how do we fit in? The world doesn't even know where it is. I think part of what's going on in the world is that because there's so much globalization, there's so much travel, there's so much mixing without really understanding deeper places that people are pulling away from each other in all these countries because they're trying to find who I am by who I'm not. I'm not you. I'm trying to hang on to that.
Yeah.
And so that I'm sure trickles down into the TCK community. And plus, I think in our communities, probably there's more divorce, there's more family issues because of the way the world is. Whereas in the old days, most people that I would know in this international thing had intact families, not all. But that whole thing, that the changes in the world are impacting the TCK community too, in terms of, I think there's a global crisis of identity and belonging and things like this. That
it's interesting what you said about kind of almost a velocity of moving around. I mean, this is a really recent trend. I'd say 3 to 5 years. The whole digital nomad movement. I don't know how much you know about that, but it's in my entrepreneur group. I know a lot of good friends who they're nomadic now because of online work and because you can kind of and COVID has even accelerated that everyone knows they can work online. And these people are starting to have kids now, and they might spend 3 months in somewhere, 6 months somewhere else. And I'm curious to see down the line what this effect is. A lot of them have young kids, so they're not at school yet, but I know 1 or 2 people who are homeschooling or putting their kids in and out of schools, but it's like we'll spend winter in the Alps and then we'll go to Asia for the summer. Like it's an interesting model. I don't know how much you know about this movement and what you think of it in terms of your research.
Just hearing, what you're saying in that, my gut is that ultimately kids have to have some place to settle. I mean, you can't just keep uprooting people because part of development is the interaction we have with our world around us. And so when that keeps changing, then how do you re-find yourself? And so you can find your identity, I suppose, as a nomad, but the human soul wants connection.
Yeah.
It does want connection. So somewhere it does want connection. So somewhere you have to have connection. And so maybe these families have extreme connection with themselves. I mean, that it can be one place, but you have to have some place as a human being that you feel connected and belonging, or your life is like floating and you know, and maybe that's part of what's happening in the world. But I think that, you know, when the kids are little, the world is their family anyway. But
Yeah.
things like, you know, the sights and smells and all these things are part of home, and place is part of home. Place is part of our identity, how we interact with place, and our parents helping us learn these skills, and the community helping us. And you know, you've got to be somewhere connected to community. So, you know, it may be fine for a while, but I would think that at some point parents should settle long enough to give their kids some kind of stability in a place, in a community, in something. Um, that's one reason we tell people that if they can, when they repatriate or when they go back on their leaves and stuff, to go back. Maybe they don't have their own house, but to go back to that same place so that, you know, there's some sense that this is my Portuguese home or my American home or my English home or whatever, and then I have this other place. So I think it's a great idea for the parents are having a great time, but I'd be careful long term with the kids to move.
Yeah, and I'm curious if it's even going to go on long term, because it's such a new thing, like I was saying. But and again, the majority of people I know, kids are very young, but I think it'd be exhausting just traveling with children all the time. You know.
I think it'd be exhausting with kids, but I think even as an adult, it'd be exhausting because as adults, we also need connection. I moved to a new condo 2 weeks before COVID because we decided we should be on one floor. So, you know, I had torn my meniscus on a trip, and they thought, okay, fine, we need to be where we don't want to go to an old people's home too soon, you know. So we moved, and then COVID came, and I don't know my neighbors. And I'm finally getting to know a few neighbors. And I thought this was really a lonely year because if I was in my old house, I could have gone to the fence, I could have, you know, walked, great social distancing, but I didn't know anybody to walk, and you know, you couldn't really get to know people because of, you know, we were all in our homes. So even at this age, I need community, I need people, and I have a big community globally online. So I mean, I've done a lot with that, and that's been a great blessing. But you still need the people. You still need the neighbor that stops at your door and says, "Hi, you want to go for a walk?" You know, that's part of life.
Yeah, absolutely. Ruth, this is it is so rich to hear your you know, your conversations and responses and reflections, because I think for many of our audience we are international. It's International Schools Podcast. So I think for myself, this is really the first time in my life that I really talk to somebody about this third culture kid. I've read about it, and you know, you hear about it, but I've kind of not. I don't know. It hasn't really been something on my mind, but listening to you, that's really some great provocations for my own reflections, and I'm sure many of our audience will walk away much richer by the provocations you've provided. And the book is Cross Cultural Kids. It's the third edition, and it's out.
It's third culture kids.
Third Culture Kids, yeah. Sorry.
Third culture kids.
It's the Cross Culture Kids is the website, right?
Yes, that's the website, and there's a chapter in there on cross-cultural kids, and that's part of maybe I put that word out because everybody was fussing so much about who was a TCK, and nobody was allowed to be if they didn't do it a certain way. And I thought, but I want to see what the story is that's going on globally. And so if we could make a bigger paradigm, we could discuss it. But maybe the question is really third culture is this in-between space. So people that I've called cross-cultural kids still have an in-between space. If you're binational, you have an in-between space between. So maybe part of the discussion is, you know, should it be educational TCK? Should it be like we're calling traditional TCK, who you were domestic TCK if you do it in your own country? So maybe we can get a more unified language because the concept is, well, what my interest is, there's something all these groups share. And then like you're already in several circles, you know, you've been a TCK, officially a traditional, you're also a bicultural family and things like that. So how to find the paradigms to really look at this well would expedite all the research and the wonderful things that are happening. I mean, there's a huge amount of things, a fabulously interesting topic to me because it's not just personal, but it's an explanation for what we're seeing globally. And hopefully, if we could enlarge the conversation and get out of some of the old paradigms, because all the old ways of measuring development and looking at all kinds of things were done with models that were pre-globalization, Erickson's model and all. So how does that compare? But I will leave that to the next generation. My main job now is to help people behind me get a vision for what still needs to happen. And there's some great things in the pipeline now.
Fantastic.
Great. Well, Ruth, thank you very much. It's been a pleasure talking. Hopefully we can get you back on the podcast, because I'm sure John and me are going to think of another 10 questions right after we stop recording. But well, where can people find you online? Are you active anywhere? LinkedIn, Twitter, website?
I'm on LinkedIn. They can write me at rdvanreken@aol.com. I know that's a prehistoric address, but I'm prehistoric and I don't want to change it because it's what everybody knows. But it's Ruth David R.D. Van Reken, my last name, at AOL.com. And I like to hear from people because I think my main thing in life is trying to, I learn from who I hear from, and I also like to encourage people, or if they have a specific question, I'm happy to try and field it. I'm not a therapist. I'm not a psychologist, but I'm a great cheerleader. I believe that we can do it together.
So to our audience, Third Culture Kids Growing Up Among the Worlds, third edition, and definitely get onto your whatever bookstore you use and get that book, because I think it's absolutely fascinating read. And Ruth, thank you for also being so generous and saying to our audience, reach out to me. That's very kind. And we will put your coordinates on our show notes.
Great.
Ruth, thank you. Just absolutely fascinating and such a rich conversation. Dan and I now are going to come up with why didn't we ask her that? Why didn't we ask her this?
Well, I'm happy to come back. I'm sitting here in my condo looking for stuff to do. So.
We will have you back.
Thank you.
Thanks, Ruth.
Thanks. I appreciate it very much. And appreciate those who are out there working with TCKs in all the schools. You have a huge job. You have a fabulous job, but also you are on the cusp of studying and thinking and seeing what's going on in the globe right in your school. So don't ever underestimate your own perceptions and your own visions and your own understandings of how we can do this better, because we all need it. And it's a team job.
Great. Thanks, Ruth.
Okay. Thank you.
Thank
Bye
you,
now.
Ruth.